Hi, my name is Madison Pesowski, and I'm a postdoc working with Dr. Adina Schaffner at the University of California, San Diego. Today, I'll be talking about two studies showing that children use inverse planning to detect social transmission in the design of artifacts. We are constantly surrounded by human-made objects or artifacts, and this is true from early in development and in cultures around the world. These artifacts are important to us as humans. To function in any human society, we have to learn to use artifacts as tools. But artifacts are more than just tools. They also convey social information. We know from work in social psychology that people make quick and accurate judgments about others from their objects, such as a person's traits, interests, and even their social identity. We refer to this process of inferring social information from an artifact's features as intuitive archaeology. When an archaeologist pulls an object out of the ground, they don't just consider its physical properties. They ask what the object can tell them about the people who created it. Like intuitive archaeologists, we too make social inferences from objects others create. But the question is, how do we do this? What cognitive processes do we use to infer social information from objects' features? To understand this domain, we're going to begin by characterizing how people detect social transmission or copying of design ideas. This is because copying detection serves as a foundation for this domain, in that depending on whether the design is copied or not, it will license different inferences. For instance, if a design was copied, it can tell you about someone's social history, what people and ideas the person has interacted with. It may even tell you about their honesty and morality, for instance, in the case of plagiarism. In contrast, if the design was original, it doesn't tell you those things, and instead it might tell you about the creator's intelligence or creativity. So how do we infer whether ideas were copied or generated independently? Let's consider an example. Imagine two people were asked to build a train track that connected these two houses, and they both built train tracks that look like this. Now, what do you think? Did they copy each other or make them independently? In this case, most people guess that someone copied. The question is, how did you do this? Well, for this example, it looks like you might be doing something quite simple. Maybe you're just noticing that these two train tracks look identical and are using a simple heuristic that designs that look more similar are more likely copied. But let's consider this more informative case. Imagine that the people built these two train tracks. Now, do you think someone copied? Here, the tracks are still identical, but you probably made a different inference. It's not so clear that anyone copied in this case because this is the best answer. It's the most efficient way from A to B. So this suggests that you're using a more complex reasoning process than just detecting similarity. Instead of just reasoning that copying led the people to make the same design, you're using efficiency as an alternative explanation. And because the goal of efficiency can explain how they made the same design, this weakens the evidence of copying. This explaining away is a hallmark of rational causal inference. And in past experiments with adults, this is what we find. In particular, we propose that people use the process of inverse planning to reason about design. Basically, people have knowledge of the generative process, what they would build if they had a particular goal and were in a particular environment. The idea of inverse planning is that people can invert this planning process to reason about artifacts others have made. So from seeing the features of an artifact, adults can make inferences about the actions that had to happen to make that artifact and the creator's goals and environmental constraints. Today, we're examining the development of this reasoning by asking whether children use inverse planning to reason about the origins of design ideas, in particular, whether a design was copied. You might be wondering why study this in children. There are a few reasons why understanding the development of this reasoning is important. First, it's reasonable to expect that children might not be able to do this. Reasoning about people from objects is a complex form of reasoning, one that requires bridging the domains of physical and social reasoning. So this work bears on two broader questions. To what extent do children integrate their mental theories of the physical and social world? And is children's reasoning best characterized as driven by perceptual biases and heuristics or flexible abstract reasoning? This question is a core debate in cognitive development dating back to Jean Piaget. And the topic of copying in particular is salient and relevant for kids. From preschool age, children can infer social affiliations from copying, and they dislike individuals who plagiarize. So the question is, how do children infer when copying has occurred? To test this, we used a train track task much like the demo you saw earlier. Children saw puppets who had each built a train track and were asked to judge if someone copied or if they made them on their own. Children were shown that each puppet had a game board grid with 2 houses on them and a set of train track pieces, some curvy and some straight. The puppets were asked to build a train track that would get the train from one house to the other house in the fastest, quickest way. Now, crucially, we manipulated what the game board looked like. In some trials, there was a barrier on the game board that the train could not travel through. And in other trials, there was no barrier and the tracks could be placed anywhere. And what this allowed us to do is manipulate how efficient the designs were while matching for the perceptual features of the design. So for example, when the puppets both built this design without the barrier, it's really an inefficient design. But when the wall is in the way, it makes that very same design the most efficient path possible. So our prediction is that children will think the tracks on the left are better evidence of copying, and that in general, they will think more efficient tracks are less likely copied than the less efficient tracks, even when the designs are identical in both cases. We tested 52 7 to 9-year-old children in this task using a within subject design. So each child judged 8 different track pairs, which differed in terms of how efficient they were and how similar they were to each other, either identical or different. All children passed a comprehension check and were able to identify which of 2 tracks was faster or shorter. And to help make the task a bit clearer for children, we also allowed them to build tracks themselves beforehand. We gave them the physical game board and track pieces and allowed them to build the track themselves, both when the barrier was present and absent. And I'm happy to talk about the role that first-person experience may play in children's reasoning during question period. Okay, so what did we find? Here I'll be showing you the proportion of children that said copying occurred, and I'll be showing you the data for each unique trial. So each bar that you're going to see represents children's judgments about one pair of tracks. And along the x-axis, we're going to arrange these tracks by the degree to which the tracks are efficient. So the most efficient tracks will be on the left, and the least efficient tracks will be on the right. First, let's focus on these 2 trials here, which are particularly informative. In both cases, the tracks are identical, and across both trials, the puppets built the exact same design. But in the case with the barrier present, this design is efficient, whereas in the other case, it is much less efficient. So if children use inverse planning, they should consider efficiency as an alternative explanation for the similarity and judge copying less likely when the barrier is present. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. Now let's look at the most efficient track, the one that goes directly from A to B. In line with the predictions of inverse planning, this efficient track is the one children say is least likely to be copied among all of our trials. This contrasts with tracks that were long and inefficient. In these trials, the tracks were inefficient even when the barrier was present and were even more inefficient when it was absent. So we see the children's copying judgments track with efficiency. That is, the less efficient, the more likely copied. And this is the case even though all of the tracks here are identical. So it can't be that children are just using a simple rule that things are more similar, that things that are more similar are more likely copied, because if they did that, all of these bars should be equal. Instead, they're taking into account the goals and constraints that shape the design, which is in line with the use of inverse planning. I should note that children are also sensitive to how similar the tracks are. On the right, you see data from trials where the 2 puppets created different tracks. For these trials, children rarely said copying occurred. And this is what is predicted by both the inverse planning and perceptual heuristic accounts. But only inverse planning predicts that children will go beyond how similar the designs look and change their judgments depending on efficiency, as they did in the identical trials. So our results from this experiment show that when judging copying, children do not just use perceptual similarity to reason about artifacts' designs, but instead use inverse planning to reason about the way the design was generated. That is, they consider efficiency as an alternative explanation for similarity, as we'd expect in rational causal inference. However, there's one alternative possibility remaining of what kids might be doing. By the inverse planning account, children should be able to flexibly reason about many types of alternative explanations, but we've only looked at one, efficiency. And efficiency might be unique and privileged in children's thinking. The expectation that people act efficiently develops early, is shared by other species, and is a foundation for the entire domain of action understanding. As such, the findings so far could be consistent with a simpler system. Children may only be able to reason about efficiency in artifacts' designs rather than flexibly taking into account a wider variety of alternative explanations. So in the next experiment, we ask whether children can reason about another type of alternative explanation for artifact similarity, one that does not involve efficiency. Here's the task. Imagine you're asked to solve a puzzle where the goal is to push a button that plays music. The button, though, is inside a box and out of reach. The only way in is through this hole that's very small on the top of the box. The front window here is covered by plexiglass. To solve the puzzle, you can build a tool by connecting this handle to one of these rods. They screw together to make something like this that can fit into the puzzle box and push the button. Now imagine that you see two people have made identical tools. They each chose to use the star-shaped rod. Here, do you think someone copied? In this case, all 10 of these options would work. They all fit into the puzzle box. So it's a suspicious coincidence that both of these people chose the same design option. In this case, then, you'd think that yes, someone probably copied. Now imagine that people had been solving this puzzle box instead. The hole here is shaped like a star, and crucially, only one of the 10 rods actually fits. The rest of them wouldn't work to solve the puzzle. In this case, even though the tools are identical, you wouldn't think someone copied because there's only one good solution. To realize that, you have to think about the building process and about the constraints on which pieces would and wouldn't work. So if children are using inverse planning, they should say that copying occurred less often when they were building tools to solve the star box than the circle box. In contrast, if they're instead just considering how similar the tools look, they should give similar answers in both cases. So that's what we did, this time designing our task for younger children ages 4 and 5. To make this task simpler for younger children, here children built a tool themselves, and a puppet also built a tool from his own set of pieces. The puppet always built the same tool as the child and always finished building his tool after the child had finished, making it ambiguous as to whether the puppet copied or not. Children were then asked to judge whether the puppet had copied them or thought of it on his own. Each child either saw the puzzle box with a circle or star-shaped opening for a between subjects design. So what did we find? In this graph, the y-axis is the proportion of children who said that the puppet copied them, and along the x-axis is which puzzle box they built their tools for, either the circle box or the star box. And remember, the prediction is that children will say that copying occurred less often in the star box condition than in the circle, because the star box provides a functional constraint. And that's what we find. Children who built tools for the star box said that copying had occurred less often than children who built tools for the circle box. And this was the case even though in both cases, the puppet and child built identical tools. So even at preschool age, children are going beyond what the tools look like. They are instead taking into account the building process and whether or not there was a functional constraint and deciding whether copying occurred. So this gives us evidence once again that children use inverse planning to reason about artifacts. Here's the same data plotted slightly differently with age on the x-axis and fits from a logistic regression for the two conditions. You can see that we find this effect at all ages. Children of all ages said that copying occurred more for the circle box than the star box. And you'll notice that older children were slightly more likely to say copying occurred in both conditions. They seem to have a higher baseline belief that copying occurred. And we speculate that this may be due to recent experience of copying at this older age by starting school. So together, this work shows that children use inverse planning to reason about physical objects, thinking about objects as the products of others' actions. This reasoning process appears to be flexible and abstract. Children can take into account multiple kinds of explanations for artifacts' designs, including efficiency and functional constraints. And this type of reasoning process provides a cognitive basis for the broader domain of intuitive archaeology. From early in childhood through inverse planning, the physical objects we choose or create become tightly linked to the social world. So of course, this work just scratches the surface of this broader domain, and there's so much more to learn. In future work, we are exploring whether children use inverse planning to make other types of social inferences from artifacts, like others' intelligence and creativity, and whether these inferences also apply to other types of artifacts like art and music that may be more closely linked to a person's social history or cultural group. We're excited to investigate such questions in our lab in the future, but for now, I will say thank you for listening.